What if the moon isn't a silent rock at all, but a system with a pulse? Decades ago, Apollo 12 crashed a spent module into the lunar surface and the seismometers kept recording for far longer than anyone expected. That eerie ring wasn't music, it was mechanics. And it's just the first clue. In this film, we'll follow 7 hidden truths that reveal how the moon quietly moves, breathes, and shapes life here on Earth. Moonquakes that rattle a brittle crust. A ghostly sodium tail that sweeps past our planet every month. Signs of water and even rust in impossible places. A lumpy gravity field etched by ancient seas of lava. Cavernous lava tubes that could shelter future habitats. Split-second lunar flashes that aren't folklore but physics. And the slow outward drift that gifts us eclipses and will one day take them away. No conspiracy, no hand-waving. We'll stay with the data. Seismometers and mission logs. Lady and Chandrayaan 1. Sophia, spectra, Grail gravity maps, and laser pings from retroreflectors, still answering across the dark. If you love cinematic science that respects your curiosity and rewards, this is your kind of journey. Before we dive in, help us keep making big, evidence-driven stories. Subscribe to Beyond Our Dawn, tap the bell so you don't miss the next chapter, and tell us in the comments which hidden truth you're most excited to see. Ready? Let's go find out why the moon is more alive than you think. They observed a controlled fall, a human-made object tumbling in a dark arc toward a world that has no wind to carry echoes and no air to sing. And yet the record stated that when metal struck dust and buried rock, the ground spoke back for far longer than anyone had penciled into their notebooks. It was logged that the seismometers one could picture the small boxy sentinel, A, say, and I. They recalled in their internal memos that alive in planetary science is not a license to anthropomorphize. The word is careful. A world can be alive as a system when it exchanges energy and momentum, when it stores memory in its rocks and its orbits, when processes couple across scales so that a tremor here nicks a schedule there, and an exhalation of atoms at the edge of space paints a faint trail over a neighboring planet. It was logged that the moon, long presented to the public as a fossil, is better understood as a system with slow pulses and hidden currents. Not a biosphere, but a choreography of forces. The ground keeps records. The orbit writes ephemerides. The surface, draped with regoluthanuses, suggested a broader frame. The moon was born hot and has cooled, but cooling is not a synonym for stillness. Its orbit is locked. Tidal Loc, Spinor MIT, was logged that the moon breathes in its own way. Not with weather, because the moon has no weather as Earth does, but with a whisper thin, exosphere, THSA, Strenalysis suggested. 2. That water is not an impossibility there, but a question of form and place. Spectrometers aboard polar orbiters read out the fingerprints of OH bulbed. Thema, dark basaltic lava plains, drink more light and give the disk its face, while highlands scatter it. In that scattering is chemistry. In that chemistry, the trace of frost, and in that frost a set of ethical questions that the record stated explicitly in recent planning meetings. How to drill and melt without seeding Earth bacteria into a vault that has been clean for billions of years. They recalled that gravity itself keeps minutes. What seems like a sphere from far away reveals, up close, a patchwork of heavy basins and thickened crust. Muscons, subsurface mass concentrations causing gravity anomalies embedded like sinkers in a paper lantern. It was logged that these lumpy Fields have tugged at spacecraft trajectories, and that maps compiled from twin orbiters have painted a relief of hidden density, so crisp that the geologic past rises to the surface in color-coded stripes. The moon, in its hush, keeps account of ancient fires and impacts that sealed seas of basalt under sheets of tougher rock, and the numbers written into those fields still reach into the present. Bending orbits, nudging landers, shaping risk, they observed that to call a thing alive is to accept stewardship. Every bag of bolts left behind, every lens cap mislaid, every forgotten tool is an artifact now. The record stated that heritage and hazard share a boundary out there, that a discarded antenna can be both a museum piece and a projectile if kicked by a rover's wheel. The same document that logged a quake logged a design note for dust seals and filtration. For the moon's sharp grains will chew through fabric and O-rings if given a chance. The same page that celebrated a laser ping returning from a reflector 384,000 kilometers away penciled a reminder to flag the vector of the sodium plume before planning a long exposure, for even the faintest glow can ghost an image. Analysis suggested a path. Begin with the strike and its long echo, then walk outward through the families of quakes. Follow the airless breath that brushes earth. Pry apart the spectrum to find water and the chemistry that paints. Rust in a place with almost no free oxygen. Lay out gravity's hidden map. Step into long tubes carved by once moving lava. Look up to see sudden flashes that have not yet been tamed by a single theory. And finally step back to the orbit and the slow retreat that will one day end total eclipses, and that, for now, keeps Earth's seasons confined within bounds that life has learned. They observed that this is not a ghost story. It is a responsibility story. The moon is more alive than we think, not because it has lungs or leaves, but because it holds force and memory in ways that touch us. The record stated that the next expedition will need more sensors, cleaner hands, and humbler language. It was logged that the first question remains as heavy as the first hammer blow. If it rang, what else will answer when we knock again? They observed that the traces first puzzled students because the spikes resembled those from earthquakes, and yet the decay took its time as if the medium were tighter and drier than any crust on Earth. The record stated that the earliest catalogues, compiled from the passive seismic experiment units left on the surface, split events into families, deep moonquakes that pulsed with a regularity bound to the geometry of Earth-moon tides. Shallow moonquakes whose depth and magnitude made engineers lean forward in their chairs. Thermal creaks that arrived when the long lunar day fell into its equally long night. And impacts that lit up the charts with unmistakable signatures. It was logged that deep events, somewhere around 700 to 1200 kilometers below the surface, behaved like a metronome set by gravity. Analysis suggested that their timing could be predicted with the path of the month, and that their strength, though modest, accumulated as design load in a way that would matter for tall masts and delicate arrays. They observed that shallow moonquakes were the outliers that made hands tighten on coffee cups, because magnitudes that would rattle dishes on Earth had been recorded on a world with no oceans and no moving plates. The record stated that these sudden fractures occurred tens of kilometers beneath the surface, in a brittle shell that remembers ancient cooling and unrelieved stress, and that their waveforms contained energy at frequencies that upset assumptions about damping. It was logged that thermal quakes, which they once thought of as harmless crackles, could, in fact, generate local shivers sharp enough to masquerade as tiny blows from within, and that the regolith dust and grains arranged like a felled forest of needles could amplify or smother motion depending on how it had been fluffed by landing plumes, rover wheels, or electrostatic lift. Analysis suggested that construction standards could not be borrowed from deserts and high mountains on Earth. Without translation, they observed that foundations would need to spread loads wide to press through the top centimeters of fragile grains and key into the competent basalt or anorthosite below. That anchor points would have to be oriented and tuned to avoid resonance with the most common tidal periods. That instrument schedules should avoid delicate maneuvers near the peaks of the fortnightly stress cycle. The record stated that at the South Pole, where permanently shadowed depressions, law prospectors, and where miles of ridge and crater rim intersect slopes, add their own betrayal, and that a modest shake could loosen boulders that have not been disturbed since the last era of volcanism. It was logged that descent vehicles, if parked on the sunlit shoulder of a crater, would have to tolerate creep from thermal cycles, and that gangways and pressurized tubes should include expansion joints like those in bridges, but with ranges calibrated for temperatures that swing far more than any alpine freeze-thaw on Earth. They observed that a sparse network of 4 seismic stations, admirable as it was for its time, left large swaths of ambiguity under the lunar disk. Analysis suggested that, with modern low-power electronics and fiber-thin links, a web could be laid that listens from rim to rim, triangulating shallow ruptures and teasing apart deep tidal modes the way helioseismologists read the sun. The record stated that the experience of the Apollo era taught humility. Cables must be armored against dust. Connectors must survive the subtle sandblasting that electrostatic winds perform at local noon. Housings must endure micrometeoroid pinpricks and radiative chill. It was logged that even a small slipper misseated thermal shield. A gasket chosen from the wrong polymer becomes a long outage, where there are no repair trucks and no rainy days to hide delays. They observed that the metaphor of a bell, while vivid, risks overpromising and under-explaining. The moon's response is not musical. It is mechanical. The record stated that low attenuation and a fractured state frozen into place by time allow energy to travel and scatter with stubborn persistence, so that the tail on a seismogram extends like the contrail of a high jet across a blue sky. It was logged that this very persistence gives scientists leverage by plotting how different frequencies slow, bend, and die. Interior models can be constrained, layers and boundaries inferred, core size debated with numbers rather than adjectives. Analysis suggested that the same waveforms that make an engineer flinch also give a geophysicist a map, and between those two readers lies the practical definition of alive, a system that answers questions in one domain and sets constraints in another. They observed that design must adapt. A habitat buried in regolith to escape radiation will need its burial to be uniform to avoid uneven settlement after a tremor. The record stated that flexible connections between modules can soak up differential motion, and that mounting sensitive instruments on isolated plinth mass spring systems tuned away from dominant moonquake frequencies can keep experiments honest. It was logged that operational protocols should treat predicted deep quake windows like passing storms, scheduling extravehicular activity and crane lifts to quieter spans, and that early warning, if not perfect, can still be statistically helpful when it turns uncertainties into colored blocks on a daily timeline. Analysis suggested that all of this, the careful plotting of stressors, the choice of footing shapes, the spacing of bolts, is not a catalogue of fears but a guide to rhythm. They observed that the moon, in quakes, in thermal size, in the click of its brittle shell, conducts a rhythm that humans can learn to work with. The record stated that when the Apollo crews hammered poles or drove core tubes, they sometimes felt the ground as resistant but not treacherous, and that what betrayed them more often was dust clinging to suits and seals. It was logged that, in the next age, with longer stays and more mass to move, what once was a laboratory fact becomes a job site rule. If the first lesson of the long echo is that structure matters, the second lesson is that schedule matters too. They observed finally that the curiosity which sent that first object into the ground is the same curiosity that now sketches a net of new instruments. Analysis suggested a path to prediction, not in the sense of naming the hour of a shallow rupture, but in the sense of bounding the probabilities that make work safer. The record stated, in the plain words that underwrite budgets and lives, that on a quiet world, motion is a certainty, that on a dry world, motion travels, and that on a world that will host humans again, those two truths are enough to demand sensors, standards, and the humility to keep asking, are we listening closely enough? They observed that stress maps can be drawn like weather charts, with contours not of pressure but of tidal strain, and the record stated that when those contours sweep across a given site, the odds of a deep event rise, just as certain slopes in certain seasons on Earth are more prone to small landslides. It was logged that mission planners used these patterns to suggest maintenance windows, anchoring heavy lifts just after a tidal maximum, the way a mountain team waits for the wind to settle before stepping onto a cornice. Analysis suggested that for shallow moonquakes, whose timing is more capricious, prediction is a weaker tool, but design can backstop prediction, redundancy in supports, damping in joints, and automatic safing of delicate instruments when an accelerometer spikes. They observed that the South Polar terrain crater rims, stacked like folded paper, tongues of light reaching across shadow forces engineering to speak in both poetry and numbers. The record stated that slopes near permanently shadowed regions often hide under talus that look stable until a small jolt rearranges angles into a cascade. It was logged that landers should choose pads not just for sunlight exposure and line of sight to relay, but for the mechanical quiet learned from months of on-site listening, and that test masts raised in advance can report the micro-oscillations of the surface to refine those choices. Analysis suggested that footings might be better as hexagonal spreaders than narrow piles, and that coupling materials ought to be chosen for thermal compatibility with the rock beneath them to avoid the slow creak that can add to a quake's shove. They observed that equipment health lives and dies with dust management because the moon's grains are not rounded by rivers. They are broken by impacts and clung by charge. The record stated that dust lofting can itself be a trigger for tiny local slides, and that electrostatic conditions, particularly around sunrise and sunset, should be counted in hazard models, the way wind gusts are counted for crane operations on Earth. It was logged that the smart practice would be to include dust charge monitors alongside seismometers and temperature probes so that correlations, once anecdotal, become quantified, and that crew timelines should include the extra minutes that reality always charges when gloves are gritty and seals. Resist.analysis suggested that the moon's long echo, that emblematic decay curve on a strip chart, carries a lesson in cooperation. They observed that no single station, even with exquisite sensitivity, can localize shallow events with the certainty needed to change a day's plan. That a network 3 stations minimum, more if we are serious, turns a tremor into a location, and a location into an assessment, is the source on our ridge, beyond the next basin, or a continent away in the lunar sense. The record stated that with modern timing and cross-correlation, even lamplitude episodes can be triangulated, and that the digital maps we carry in our pockets on Earth can be mirrored on the Moon with overlays for recent quakes, stress forecasts, and equipment vibration histories. It was logged that this is how a place becomes workable, not by denying motion, but by mapping it. They observed that some stories told about the Moon are folklore, and the script must keep that distinction clean. The record stated that tales of hollow interiors and engineered hums belong on the shelf marked legend, not on the parts list of a habitat. It was logged that the real wonder is stronger, a cold, airless body that still quakes, and a crust that, by being so dry and so welded, rings with the persistence of a struck crystal. Analysis suggested that awe is safer when it is aimed at truth, because awe then drives correct questions. What is the attenuation at a given frequency band in highland anorthosite versus mare basalt? How do microfractures evolve under the hammer of thermal swings? They observed ultimately that truth won the families of moonquakes and the long eco-stands, not only as a plot point in a documentary but as a charter for work. The record stated that there will be a new network if we intend to live there, powered by the same sunlight that paints the ridges platinum at local noon, that there will be data pipes and calibration days and the human habit of arguing over baselines, that there will be boredom amid the sublime, then sudden spikes that send everyone to their consoles. It was logged that this is how a quiet world becomes a partner. We listen. It answers. We change what we build and when we move. Analysis suggested that the Moon has already taught the first lesson, and the traces are still archived. On a world where sound does not travel, the ground itself is the voice, and what it says carries farther than we guessed. They observed that a world without air still wears a veil, and the record stated that the veil is not a sky in the earthly sense, but a statistical cloud, a census of wayward atoms drifting so far apart that most never touch. It was logged that this cloud is called an exosphere, the ultra-thin outermost atmosphere where particles can escape, born when sunlight shakes grains, when micrometeoroids strike like match heads on stone, and when the solar wind trades energy, with surfaces baked and shadowed in turn. Analysis suggested that among the atoms set free, sodium has a special role because it answers the call of a very particular color of light, a pair of resonant notes that instruments on Earth can hear. Across the gulf, like a tuned ear catching a whistle in a crowded station. They observed that when the Moon's path, the Sun's glare, and Earth's receiving instruments align, a pale extension of that sodium population forms a sodium tail, a stream of sodium atoms extending from the Moon that slides past Earth. Once each month, too thin to breathe, too cool, too warm, but clear enough to record. It was logged that ground-based cameras equipped with narrow filters have watched the tail brighten and fade, and that in those rises and falls the exosphere reveals itself as a living ledger of bombardment and sunlight. The record stated that impacts by fine dust from passing meteor streams can kick sodium freeze in bursts, and that these surges sketch spikes across nights like heartbeat arrhythmias. Analysis suggested that geometry governs the show. Near new Moon, when the Sun sits behind the lunar disk from Earth's point of view, radiation pressure sweeps sodium atoms into a comet-like train. Near full moon, the angles mute the display. They observed that while the public once spoke of halos and mystical effluence, the technicians on mountaintops talk, instead of photon counts, of airglow that must be subtracted, of the moonset scatter. that must be modeled, and of the moon's role as both source and mirror. In that mirror, albedo, the fraction of sunlight reflected, sets the brightness of the face we see, while resonance sets the tale we can measure. It was logged that a spacecraft called Lady traced this veil from within, sniffing the low-density mix and counting atoms with patience impossible from the ground. The record stated that the orbital path dipped and climbed through patches where sodium, potassium, and other species thickened and thinned, their densities folded by radiation pressure and magnetic wrinkles and by the moon's own relief. Analysis suggested that this is not weather, yet patterns recur like weather, and that, with enough passes, one can predict when a tail will wax. They observed that the exosphere responds quickly to micrometeoroid showers, a kind of percussion section that adds sharp notes, and that sunlight's angle across the regolith, loose surface debris of dust and rock modulates the baseline, release as grains charge and discharge. It was logged that electrostatic lofting near the terminator lifts the thinnest powders into a low dance, and though those particles are too heavy to join the tail directly, their motion helps knock the atoms that do. They observed that the language of tails invites metaphor, but the numbers keep the romance anchored. The record stated that the average sodium column density in the line of sight during a good window is measured in units that would make a meteorologist laugh, that even at its brightest, the tail is a whisper compared to aurora or noctilucent clouds. It was logged that nonetheless these counts are precious because they tell a story of ongoing exchange. The moon is not a rock in a vacuum so much as a rock slowly unbuttoning, atom by atom, into space. Analysis suggested that this clarity brings responsibilities to builders and photographers alike. The tail is not dangerous, but the electric fields that accompany the charging that releases sodium can matter to equipment. They observed that near sunrise and sunset, when the surface's charge swings, dust lofting can foul seals, and that planning in EVA or a long exposure would be wiser with this rhythm in mind. It was logged that the exosphere's dynamics also tie the moon to Earth's own extended atmosphere. The record stated that during certain parts of Earth's magnetotal cycle, when our planet's magnetic drape swings over the moon, oxygen ions can drift and later imprint signatures in rust and frost. That coupling belongs to another truth, but shows itself here. Analysis suggested that in a universe that loves scale, even the thinnest air writes lines across distant readers. They observed that when arrays on mountaintops integrate photons from the sodium dialynes, the sum tells them not only that sodium is present, but that it is being pushed, accelerated into a tail by sunlight and by the gravitational choreography that makes tidal locking spin-orbit coupling that keeps one face toward Earth our nightly constant. It was logged that the moon exhales, the tail drifts, and Earth passes through that breath each month without notice, unless one has tuned eyes and a ledger to receive it. They observed a practical conclusion forming like frost on glass. And its tail will not push over instruments or erode pylons, but they are part of a larger electrical and particulate environment that explorers must respect. The record stated that antennas should be cleaned with methods that do not scratch coatings a million fine cuts deeper, that camera plans should acknowledge the chance of faint sodium ghosts in certain frames, and that long-term monitoring will turn this month-to-month ghost into a climatology of space dust and sunlight over a neighbor we thought was mute. It was logged that in the quiet, where there is almost no air, the smallest signals become the best teachers, and that those who learned to listen for them began to hear other whispers too, the heat hiding in shadows, the chemistry bound to grains. the gravity that bulges where ancient seas froze solid. They observed that the sodium plume is not a single ribbon, but a braided procession. Its brightness sculpted by the moon's position, by the sun's pressure, and by tiny storms of dust that arrive with a calendar of meteoroid streams. The record stated that during encounters with showers like the Leonids or Geonids, instruments on dark peaks count more photons at the sodium lines. That these counts do not merely echo spectacle in Earth's sky, but record violence on the moon's skin as sand-grain projectiles liberate atoms. It was logged that fresh impacts in the regolith produce bursts, then decays, a pulse and trail curve that analysts cross-correlate with known streams and with Lady's insight to counts to untangle, source, and transport. Analysis suggested that the plume's cadence, week by week, is a graph of ongoing surface weathering, a measure of how quickly the topmost dust ages, charges, and crumbles. They observed that solar radiation pressure herds sodium into a long tail that points away from the sun, so that near new moon, when the sun, moon, and Earth align, the tail can sweep past our planet like a transparent banner. The record stated that observers who tune their filters and wait for the right geometry can trace this banner across tens of Earth radii, and that, in some seasons, the brightness here and there hints at knots and folds where forces balance and then give way. It was logged that the structure reacts to the solar cycle as well. Changes in ultraviolet output and in the solar wind's temper influence how many atoms are knocked loose and how long. They keep their energy before they are ionized or captured. Analysis suggested that exosphere science refuses to be parochial. One must know the regolith's chemistry, the sun's current, and the geometry of orbit to make sense of a single night's data. They observed that this tail brushes Earth without consequence to lungs or leaves, and yet it matters because it is a ledger of connectivity. The record stated that the moon's exhalations pass through Earth's broader environment, and that our own planet, in turn, changes what the moon can oxidize when Earth's magnetail washes over the lunar surface and ferries oxygen to distant latitudes. It was logged that this exchange, periodic and faint, provides a bridge to the later tail of hematite on the far side, where oxygen, arriving from Earth during specific windows, together with fine water and the right mineral precursors, can lay down a patina of rust where one would not expect rust to live. Analysis suggested that this is how disciplines braid. Tail physics informs mineralogy, and mineralogy asks for exosphere timing, and both demand that orbits and light be known precisely. They observed that images can mislead when the mind wants a comet, and the data yield a contour plot. The record stated that the sodium tail is not luminous to the human eye. One needs long integration, Stokes parameters, careful subtraction of sky glow, and a willingness to accept a gentle rise where showmanship craves a blaze. It was logged that this is good practice for the moon in general, where many of the most consequential signals are not the dramatic ones, but the steady ones that add up. Millimeters per year in the lunar retreat measured by retroreflector arrays, left by crews, a fraction of a degree in climate stability gifted by the moon's tug, a few parts per million in a spectral dip that betrays OHO bound to grains. Analysis suggested that those who fall in love with the moon's faint tail become the kind of watchers who can love frost that only a radiometer can see. They observed operational implications threading through the romance. The record stated that the same solar angles that amplify the sodium tail also challenge cameras with glare and diffraction. That scheduling long exposure science on the nights when geometry is kind must weave between glare from a thin crescent and the shadow of Earth, It was logged that relay satellites and surface stations could share forecasts as readily as meteorologists share cloud maps, because the tail's stronger nights are predictable from known showers and orbital phase. Analysis suggested that we will end up with a space weather report for a place without weather. A tidy irony that becomes ordinary. Once one has planned a week of work in crater country and found that the quietest times for delicate measurements are as real a constraint as the sun's altitude, they observed, finally, that truth too is an education in humility. The record stated that a wisp of sodium, invisible to an unprepared eye, becomes the anchor for the claim that the moon is active. Atoms leave. Atoms arrive, and the pattern of their travel repeats the metronome that locks the moon's face to us and sinks tides that pull at Earth's crust. It was logged that the same sequence that tells a cameraman when to open the shutter tells a chemist when to look for oxidation on Highland's dust. Analysis suggested that the moon's exosphere and its tail do not make a spectacle. They make a system. Those who have learned to read that system will be ready when the story turns to water bound in shadow and to minerals that should not exist, and yet do, because a neighbor's breath sometimes crosses a neighbor's threshold. They observed that the moon's dryness was once treated as doctrine, and the record stated that early samples came home powdered and parched, their jars smelling too many like spent fireworks and their spectra clean of obvious waterlines. Was logged that this confidence in dryness worked its way into metaphors and into briefings until a new generation of instruments asked the surface again and found not rivers or rhyme in sunlit fields, but signatures in light that are hard to fake. Analysis suggested that spectrometers riding in orbit, particularly a mapper attuned to infrared modes of hydroxyl and water, recorded absorptions at wavelengths that match OHO chemistry, and that these features strengthened toward high latitudes where cold holds on to weak bonds better than equatorial noon. They observed that the story shifted from no water to what kind, where, and how bound. And the moon's encyclopedia gained new chapters. It was logged that Chandrayaan-1 carried an instrument often abbreviated to M, and the record stated that its maps showed widespread signals consistent with hydroxyl bound to silicates and with some molecular water in cooler terrains. It was logged also that an airborne observatory, flying above most of Earth's vapor, later pointed its telescope to a well-known crater and found confidence in HO absorption features, making the case that at least some molecules sit in environments that are not only hydroxyl chemistry or instrument artifact. Analysis suggested that permanently shadowed regions PSRs by the shorthand of planners provide traps where volatiles can lie for geologic time, a place so cold that a molecule knocking around the regolith, loose surface debris of dust and rock can settle and not be chased off by the sun for millions or billions of years. They observed that neutrons, counted by detectors tracing the splash of cosmic rays through the shallow subsurface, lose some of their number where hydrogen is abundant. And the record stated that such neutron suppression painted polar maps the way tide marks paint a pier. It was logged that thermal readings from orbiters, scaling their lenses over darkness deeper than night, reported temperatures low enough to make ice stable beyond the span of human empires. Analysis suggested that the chemistry is not simple. Some water is tightly bound in minerals. Some is frost in micro-cold traps. Some may travel molecule by molecule along temperature gradients that exist at grain scales, a ghost of a water cycle. In a world without rain, they observed that the term albedo, the fraction of sunlight reflected, returns here because bright patches can betray ice just beneath a thin blanket of dust. while dark lanes may hide it if grains are turned and packed by impacts or electrostatic lift. It was logged that Mare Maria, dark basaltic lava plains, and highlands differ in composition and in habit. The record stated that iron and titanium-rich basalts in the Maria hold heat longer and reflect less, complicating the task of mapping frost by brightness alone. That anorthositic highlands glitter and cool by a different rhythm. It was logged that PSRs, not all in deep craters but also in scalloped depressions along ridges, may host patchwork caches of ice, trapped in micro-bays, no wider than a room and in pits that could swallow stadiums. Analysis suggested that if exploration seeks a sustainable foothold, water is both resource and responsibility. Drink, breathe, burn if you must, but measure first, and measure in ways that do not salt the sample with your breath or your machines. They observed that the chain between exosphere and ice is not a straight line, but the links are there. The record stated that solar wind protons, implanted in grains over eons, can meet oxygen released during Earth's magnetatal seasons and form hydroxyl that later gathers where cold welcomes it. That micrometeoroids deliver molecules from deep space, that outgassing from the moon's own interior, if present, would add another thread. It was logged that this is why exosphere physics appeared in the same notebooks as water mapping. Timing the arrival of oxygen changes expectations. For where oxidation will occur, and the presence of even faint HO alters how dust sticks, how thermal cycles stress, and how instruments must be cleaned and calibrated. Analysis suggested that in this light, water is not merely a prize to be extracted, it is a signal to be read about the moon's past and the ongoing exchange with Earth and Sun. They observed practical lines drawn around all this. The record stated that drilling into a PSR without a plan for contamination would be an ethical error, that heat leaks from equipment can erase the very gradients that make cold traps work, that footprints where frost is brittle can become scars older than cities. It was logged that explorers will need gentle rigs, clean lines, and methodical experiment sequences that bring samples into light only where shadow can be revived, perhaps in cold boxes that hold temperature the way dive tanks hold pressure. Analysis suggested that stewardship will not kill ambition. It will make it possible to stay. They observed that Truth 3 begins as a debate in wavelengths and ends as a code of conduct. The moon holds water of several kinds in several places. We have proofs from spectroscopy and neutrons and thermal physics, and if we wish to use it, we must first prove that we can see it clearly. Leave it be when we should, and take it only when we know how to measure what our taking changes. They observed that rust should not belong on a world this dry. And the record stated that when mineral maps hinted at hematite, form of iron oxide that on Earth often asks for liquid water or at least humid oxidizing conditions, eyes narrowed, and models were revised. It was logged that spectral signatures consistent with hematite appeared more readily on high-latitude terrains and, intriguingly, with a bias toward the far side where Earth's face does not shine, and analysts began to trace a path that ran not through streams and rain, but through the strange weather of space. Analysis suggested that during certain portions of a month, when the moon moves through Earth's magnetale, oxygen sourced in our upper atmosphere can flow outward and wrap around the lunar globe, a slow-motion wind carrying the very ingredient rust demands. They observed that add to this a dust grain containing iron, a sprinkling of solar wind protons that are sometimes suppressed by the magnetotale and sometimes not. and temperatures low enough to let reactions creep over geological days, and you have the outlines of oxidation in a place where air never pools. It was logged that the spectral evidence came first, the slight dips and rises, where hematite likes to sign its name in light. And the record stated that laboratory spectra of analog samples helped anchor those interpretations to mineralogy, rather than to quirks of angle or instrument. It was logged also that at high latitudes, where OH signals strengthen, there is both a better chance of trace water participating in oxidation and a lower chance of thermal erasure, since cold preserves surface films and coatings. Analysis suggested that impacts deliver fresh iron surfaces, that micrometeoroid gardening turns soils to present new faces for chemistry, and that oxygen's occasional visits during magnetale seasons tip reactions along. They observed that none of this makes the moon a wet world. It makes it a reactive world under specific lights in a slow theater. They observed that the connection to earlier truths is not academic. The record stated that the sodium tail is the visible part of the exosphere's traffic, and oxygen's route is the invisible part of Earth's traffic in the other direction. Together, they form a loop in which both bodies share more than gravity. It was logged that this loop reaches into ethics again, because if Earth's oxygen can seed rust in polar regolith, then the footprints and exhaust plumes of visiting machines can change redox balances on a scale that matters to fine chemistry. Analysis suggested that resource maps must not be static images but moving pictures that account for the calendar of Earth's magnetale and for the timing of solar storms that alter implantation rates and sputtering yields. They observed that what a prospector finds in one season may be different in the next, not because the deposit is gone, but because the surface chemistry's dial has been nudged. It was logged that skepticism is necessary wherever a surprise appears. The record stated that some argued for alternative explanations, strimmed crosstalk, space weathering products masquerading as oxides, viewing geometry that can fool a ratio, but that cross-calibration and repeated passes chipped away at those doubts. It was logged that the remaining picture is one of patchiness. Hematite is not everywhere and is not thick, but it is present where the ingredients align. Analysis suggested that this patchiness is an opportunity for field science of the best kind. Traverse plans can cross boundaries between rust-favored and rust-shy terrains to test hypotheses directly with corers, microscopic imagers, and tiny ovens that sniff gases as grains are warmed. They observed that if hematite formation is ongoing at a glacial pace, then fresh surfaces should differ from ones a few million years older, and in those differences lies a clock that could date faint processes the way tree rings date seasons. They observed, finally, that truth 3 is about water in a wide sense, not lakes and not snowbanks in sunlight, but molecules bound to grains, frost in shade, and oxygen meeting iron to leave a stain that testifies to a coupling with Earth. The record stated that among the moon's many contradictions, this one is elegant. A dry world that wears a chemistry that hints at moisture. A far side more oxidized than the near in places because Earth's long magnetatal arc and the slow dance of month and season write their schedule into rock. It was logged that explorers who hope to live in lava tubes and drink from ice will have to learn this calendar as surely as farmers learn monsoons, because chemistry sets the tone for corrosion, for adhesives, for the preservation of sample surfaces that tell stories. Analysis suggested that what began as a spectral curiosity has become a map-making campaign, and that the maps we draw from it will decide where we walk, what we scrape, and how we keep the truth of a place intact even as we ask it for help in. Staying there, they observed that gravity can be drawn like weather too, with isobars replaced by equipotentials, and the records stated that when twin spacecraft chased each other in low lunar orbit and timed their separation with exquisite care, the map that emerged showed a world whose pull is not smooth. It was logged that beneath certain dark plains the mare, Maria, that once ran with basalt their sitmaskens, subsurface mass concentrations causing gravity anomalies, dense roots of ancient impacts and floods of rock that never quite cooled into uniformity. Analysis suggested that these buried heavies tug at passing craft, speeding and slowing them by whispers that integrate into kilometer drifts if left uncorrected, and that the near side's thin crust and iron-rich basalts help explain a lopsidedness that the far side's thicker shell does not share. They observed that the moon's true shape, if one means by shape the geoid, the surface of equal potential, is dimpled and offset, a fossil of heat and hammering preserved because time there does not convect and erase as it does under Earth's plates. It was logged that mission planners once learned this lesson the hard way when expected orbits wandered and fuel margins tightened, and the record stated that the new gravity models turned those surprises into routine burns penciled into flight plans. It was logged that this is not pedantry. A lander descending along a corridor that grazes a maskin can find itself arriving fat or lean by seconds that matter when engines are small and slopes unforgiving. Analysis suggested that even the moon's core sits a little off-center, that the gravitational field, taken whole, writes an autobiography of asymmetry. They observed that to read it correctly is to know where the Maria hides denser troves, where crust buckled into highlands, and where the planetesimal storms of early time left scars so deep that only numbers can trace them now. They observed that these lumpy pools also tell a story about ancient seas, not of water but of lava, and the record stated that the near side's smooth faces are not simply paint on stone but thick, heavy blankets that sagged and then froze in place. It was logged that the Grey-Lunar maps stitched orbital perturbations into a quilt of colors that geologists read the way a surgeon reads an angiogram, following flow and blockage, source and sink. Analysis suggested that to call the moon alive includes this kind of memory. Gravity keeps its own diary. What once flowed still weighs more. What once shattered still rings subtly in how a satellite's clock must be corrected as it flies. They observed that the practical consequence is dignity, for the unseen designers treat numbers like cliffs and dunes because, out there, they are. They observed that navigation became a craft of listening, and the record stated that flight dynamics. Teams learned to treat low lunar orbits as tightropes strung across invisible valleys and over invisible hills. It was logged that when a craft passes above a maskin, the ground track tends to curl and the periapsis to sink unless small thrusters whisper at the right moments, and that in early years such whispers were louder than expected because the map was poor. Analysis suggested that now the route from insertion to landing can be drawn with confidence, with error bars that respect the moon's uneven heart, and that landers can preload corrections to avoid arriving with the wrong vertical speed at a rim where the dust hangs and falls like a slow curtain. They observed that even surface operations inherit this field. The record stated that radio links, when used to help locate rovers and beacons, are bent by geometry that assumes a potential. That radar soundings of subsurface layers profit from knowing exactly how fast a craft is accelerated or eased as it sweeps along a transect. That tethered relays must hold station against tiny but cumulative tugs. It was logged that the map of gravity is, in effect, another terrain layer, and that cartographers now stack it alongside elevation and reflectance, the way hikers stack contour, trail, and shade. Analysis suggested that in that stacking there is a philosophical twist worth keeping. Gravity's map is a record of what the moon once did, where it filled, where it cracked, where it cooked long, and where it cooled fastened to work there. Is to respect a history that acts on the present through numbers alone. They observed a human dimension hidden in the calculus. The record stated that operations people sleep better when the field is known, that fuel budgets shrink and payloads grow when the lumpy pull is charted, that a gram not burned is a gram carried for tools or shields or books. It was logged that historians of exploration will point to the gravity maps as cultural artifacts, work that turned mystery into margin and margin into possibility. Analysis suggested that Truth 4 is less cinematic than a plume or a quake, and yet more binding, because it is the operating system beneath the show. The moon's weight is arranged in a pattern we can read, and once we read it, descent feels less like a gamble and more like a conversation with a place that answers in accelerations. They observed that darkness can be a wall and a shelter, and the record stated that when orbiters peered with radar and thermal eyes into riles and pit craters, they found voids that matched the shapes of rivers of stone gone hollow. It was logged that such voids are lava tubes, hollow conduits left by flowing lava, caves where roofs once floated on molten currents and then cooled into arches stable enough to span city blocks or, by some estimates, miles. Analysis suggested that inside such chambers temperature swings smooth into a muted line, radiation slackens, and micrometeoroids that pepper the surface like hail find stone to stop them before they can reach a habitat's skin. They observed that if any place on the moon invites the word refuge without sentimentality, it is here, in tunnels carved by fire and preserved by stillness. It was logged that imagery showed skylights, punctures where roofs collapsed, access and hazard in equal measure, and the record stated that slopes around these mouths are treacherous with talus and dust. It was logged that yet the promise is strong. Dig less, use natural mass as a shield. Leave the regolith to lie where it has lain, and build where it cannot drift so easily. Analysis suggested that a habitat tucked into a tube could be pressurized and warmed with less power than a dome perched in sunlight, that storage tanks and laboratories could line the walls like beads, and that farms grown under light piped from the surface or built from efficient arrays could be tended instead of suits. They observed that the map for such a home would be three-dimensional in truth: routes to sunlight, routes to ice, routes to relay, and routes to safety sealed against dust and collapse. They observed that geology and ethics meet under these roofs. The record stated that a first entry must be gentle, with survey drones and anchors and redundant winches, because a misstep in a cave can be fatal the way a bad line on a cliff can be, and there is no rescue helicopter in the vacuum. It was logged that yet to ignore these rooms, because they are risky, would be to ignore the best compromise between exposure and protection that the moon offers. Analysis suggested that if the moon is alive as a system, then lava tubes are its bones, and to live there is to learn their load paths, their cracking thresholds, and their dust habits until they are as familiar as a ship's compartments to a crew that trusts steel because it knows steel by heart. They observed that engineering inside stone asks for a different poetry, and the record stated that the first design drawings for tube habitats looked like submarines nested in caverns, pressure holes braced against rough walls, and floors leveled by sintered berms. It was logged that dust control would define comfort and survival, since the moon's grains cling and cut. Vestibules must rinse suits with fields and light rather than with water. Seals must shrug off abrasive edges, and filters must be accessible, enough to invite constant care. Analysis suggested that anchoring would be a craft of locally tuned bolts and grout that respects temperature cycles and the stone's microfractures, that span members should bow to keep loads in compression where rock is strongest, and that emergency partitions must close like ship doors when a puncture or a quake asks every room to be its own lifeboat. They observed that life support rhythms would change underground. The record stated that heat management eases when walls do not soak up noon and surrender it at night, but that waste heat must still be pushed outward through radiators in permanent shadow or along shafts that can shine to the sky. It was logged that farms would love the constant climate but demand photons delivered by cable or waveguide, and that condensate would collect differently when gravity is gentle and air is dry. By design, analysis suggested that logistics are kinder here too. Spares can sit on shelves without subliming frost. ESAs brought from PSRs can be handled without racing the sun. Instruments that hate dust can live deeper in. They observed that the trade is a beautiful one. Sunlight is farther, but stability is closer. Scenery is gone, but survivability improves. And the moon's quiet becomes an ally rather than a threat. They observe that the ethics of caves extend from safety to heritage. The record stated that these tubes are geologic archives. Their walls record flow units and mineral bands that tell time, and to pour concrete over every story would be to erase what we came to read. It was logged that a wise settlement would zone its rooms. Science preserved here. Living there, utilities apart, with paths that let students in a century trace with their hands the lines of ancient lava, the way students now trace fossils in desert cliffs. Analysis suggested that Truth 5 is an instruction written in stone. Adapt to what the moon already built. Keep dust out of lungs and bearings. And remember that a refuge that teaches is better than a fortress that forgets. They observed that sometimes the moon flashes when no one expects it, and the record stated that for centuries observers at eyepieces drew notes of brief glows, of mists, of colors where colors do not belong. It was logged that the catalogue of such moments later, called transient lunar phenomena, TLPs, grew fat with entries and thin in certainty, because the eye is fallible and the air above domes on Earth is a trickster. Analysis suggested that the modern era changed the footing. Astronauts in orbit, free of atmospheric twinkle, reported quick events. Automated images stared for nights and caught frames where a patch brightened or dimmed in ways that were not easily filed as camera, fault, or cosmic ray. They observed that the question sharpened. Is the surface exhaling gas from deep fractures? Is dust lofted by electrostatic forces at the terminator into a reflective haze? Or are micrometeoroid strikes themselves the show, tiny new craters winking as they form? It was logged that some of the best cases correlate with times and places where exosphere density and electrical conditions make lofting plausible, and the record stated that other cases sit on known fresh impact sites when before and after comparisons are available. It was logged also that a handful cluster near features where outgassing could be mechanically reasonable, the way faults on Earth breathe a bit when stressed, though the moon's cold interior argues for a modest budget of trapped volatiles. Analysis suggested that the right answer may be plural. Some TLPs are dust, some are impacts. Some are tricks of viewing that careful method can weed out. They observe that the method is the hero here. Simultaneous observers separated by long baselines, orbital and ground views paired, spectra recorded when possible to tell thermal glow from sunlight scatters, and timestamps cross-checked against micrometeoroid environment models. They observed that romance tempts storytellers to hear messages in flashes, but the record stated that caution is a better companion. It was logged that TLPs matter not because they hint at secret engines, but because they are a probe of processes already in our ledger. Electrical charging, dust behavior, impact rates, and possibly a whisper of gas. Analysis suggested that to live on the moon, one must treat every glow not as an omen, but as a data point that might say, for example, do not park a radiator here if dust likes to leap there at dusk, or instrument windows will need a sweep after meteor showers. They observed that what began as a grab bag of anecdotes has become an observing program, and in that promotion the moon's subtle life reveals itself again, flashes, small enough to doubt but numerous enough to plan around. They observed that hypotheses must learn to earn their keep, and the record stated that three broad families now vie to explain most TLPs, outgassing through fractures that open and close with stress, electrostatic lofting that raises dust into curtains along the dawn and dusk lines, and micrometeoroid impacts that, for a second or a minute, make glass and powder glow. It was logged that discriminating among these requires signatures. A gas event should carry spectral lines of volatiles. A lofting sheen should have the color and polarization of scattered sunlight and should correlate with the moving edge of day. An impact should betray itself with a hot spectrum at first and, later, a new pit in high-resolution imagery. Analysis suggested that coordinated campaigns can now collect such signatures, with orbital spectrometers alerted by ground networks the way lightning mappers, Q radio, arrays during storms on Earth. They observed that artifacts must be hunted as rigorously as phenomena. The record stated that cosmic rays can puncture detectors with bright flecks, that compression can ripple frames, that atmospheric dispersion at low moon can smear color into a false flare, and that tired eyes make patterns from noise. It was logged that protocols now insist on paired observers or on auxiliary sensors accelerometers that would feel a local tremor if one existed, dust counters that would spike if a lift occurred, radio monitors that would hear the hiss of an impact's plasma. Analysis suggested that once artifacts are excused, what remains still points to a moon that acts, if only in pinpricks and veils, the same physics that raises dust on solar arrays and etches. Glass leaves its autograph in the sky as a faint change. One can measure. They observed that Truth 6 is, in the end, about method as much as about light. The record stated that to accept a flash is to accept responsibility for the taxonomy that follows, and that this taxonomy then feeds back into design. Field of view heaters to shrug off frost that pretends to be a glow. Dust wipers built with materials that do not wear into the optics they protect. Parking rules that keep sensitive gear out of likely plumes at sunrise. It was logged that the moon, ever the teacher of small signals, asks practitioners not for belief but for patience. Analysis suggested that patience pays, because when the last false positive is wrung from a dataset, the truth that remains is the kind you can build a schedule on. They observed that a pulse of light leaves Earth, bounces from glass corners on a silent plane, and returns carrying time. And the record stated that accumulation of such pulses over decades has made a simple claim heavy with consequence. The moon is receding from Earth. It was logged that the retroreflector arrays mirror grids left by crews and by later missions send back photons so faithfully that a change of millimeters per year can be weighed against noise, and that the models which tie these distances to tides on Earth and to the moon's tidal locking spin-orbit coupling that keeps one face toward Earth have converged. Analysis suggested that as energy is dissipated in ocean basins and in Earth's own crust, angular momentum trades hands so that our day lengthens imperceptibly while the moon's orbit swells, and geometry takes notes in a far future total. Solar eclipses will cease because the moon's apparent disk will shrink. They observed that this slow drift is not a trivia, but a keystone in climate and in calendars. The record stated that Earth's axial tilt is steadied by a companion of this mass and distance, that simulations without the moon find wilder swings in obliquity that would tug climates into regimes less friendly to continuity, and that life's long experiments with forests and reefs may owe their persistence in part to this quiet gyroscope overhead. It was logged that eclipses, too, are a window of coincidence. Their poetry disk on disk, corona-crowned, belongs to a slice of time that will close. Analysis suggested that to say the moon is alive includes this very slowness, this slow arithmetic, by which tides lift countenance by inches, by which days lengthen by a breath, by which the photometry of noon in ancient strata hints at hours shorter than hours. They observed that the same pulses that proved the retreat also calibrate everything from gravity tests to geodesy that locks continents together across the sea. The record stated that a corner cube on a dusty plain is a cathedral of patience. It works if the air above the telescope is steady, and if the clocks are honest, and if those who keep them show up every night they can. It was logged that the reward is bigger than numbers. It is a narrative in which a hammer blow in a lab, a fiber in a trench, and a mirror in an airless dark all conspire to write that our world and its moon are a coupled oscillator slowly changing key. Analysis suggested that in this key lies the finale of the seven, where the moon proves its life by changing hours in increments so small that only generations can feel them, and yet so sure that even a single photon returning to the dish tonight can testify. They observed that climate's patience depends on a steady hand, and the record stated that Earth's axial tilt, which governs seasons and the distribution of sunlight over millennia, wanders less wildly because a nearby mass steadies the spin. It was logged that models exploring alternate history's worlds, where the moon never formed or departed, early returned climates lurching between extremes, where ice lines advanced and retreated in spasms, and the long experiments of forests, reefs, and grasslands were truncated by violent resets. Analysis suggested that the coupling between ocean basins, tidal dissipation, and the lunar torque acts as a damper on obliquity's oscillations, gifting geologic time with corridors of relative stability in which evolution can move beyond recovery and into invention. They observed that this is not a fairy tale, but a chain of numbers, retro-reflected distances, climbing millimeter by millimeter, energy lost to tides, measured in heat and silt, precession cones traced in mathematics by those who map inertia and torque, and spectral lines in shells and salts that archive solar angles as real as any photograph. It was logged that human calendars, from stone circles to radio clocks, align themselves to this slow duet, and the record stated that Rare alignments where shadow and light become architecture themselves, a time-limited gift. It was logged that in the deep future, when the moon's disk shrinks against the sun, totality will give way to annular crowns, and the gasp that cities once shared under noonborn night will be a museum piece. Analysis suggested that to say, "We inhabit a window" is not romantic but actuarial, that for a few tens of millions of years circlets of shadow and beads of sunlight thread our skies, and that within this window humans learned to measure, to compare, to predict, to trust a universe that keeps appointments. They observed that this habit of trust, born from watching tides rise with the moon and shadows fall with clockwork, spills into science and governance alike. For societies that can anchor their days and seasons can also anchor their plans. They observed that Truth 7 closes the ledger with a paradox. The moon appears changeless in a human life, and yet the systems that bind it to Earth drift so surely that a laser's journey can prove it on a single night. The records stated that sea cliffs and coral heads have counted these cycles longer than temples have stood. That laminae in deep sediment whisper of year lengths and day lengths not our own, and that the whirls of biological calendars might hatches, blooms keep time with tides as faithfully as pendulums keep time with gears. It was logged that the modern phrasing for all this is sober. Laser ranging confirms the recession. Tidal models and celestial mechanics spread that fact across climate and calendars. And the moon's tidal locking is the visible face of a deeper accounting. Analysis suggested that in such steadiness there is a proof of life that does not require lungs, a coupled oscillator whose slow change shapes the range in which complexity can persist. They observed, in closing the truth, that those who stand in the moon's shadow during a total eclipse are witnessing not a miracle, but a chapter near the middle of a book that will keep turning pages, and that gratitude is the correct scientific response to a cosmos that, for a while, lets beauty and stability share a frame. They observed that when the seven are set side by side, a portrait emerges that makes alive precise. The record stated that in quakes and long echoes, the crust declares its brittleness and its memory, that in an exosphere no thicker than a thought, the surface exhales atoms that paint a sodium tail across the dark for those who know how to see that in spectral dips and neutron deficits, OHO and frost shelter in PSRs, while oxygen from Earth's magnetotale helps write red stains of hematite on select highlands. It was logged that beneath the familiar face, mascons and a displaced geoid show gravity's fossil topography, a map of seas of basalt set like lead under parchment, that within the moon's bones, lava tubes offer rooms already roofed and walled, where people can trade vacuum for air without inventing cave from scratch. And that along the fringes of dawn and dusk, or under the strike of sand-grain meteors, brief TLPs flicker, reminding watchers that even a quiet surface moves and changes, when charge and dust and impact dictate. Analysis suggested that the last truth recession and the restraint of obliquity casts a slow light across all the rest, an orbital conversation that steadies climates and lengthens days, making room for patient projects and long attention. They observed the connections threading these truths into a system. The record stated that tides that flex Earth also set the cadence of deep moonquakes, that the exospheres, ebbs and surges answer micrometeoroid seasons and solar moods, and that those same seasons deliver iron faces for rust and puddle oxygen into leeward labs of cold, that gravity's lumps both archive volcanism and steer the cameras and cranes that will catalogue it, that tubes born hot, end as shelters for cool experiments whose optics must be guarded against dust that whispers upward when electric fields change sign. It was logged that evidence pairings mirror the system's couplings. Seismology plus mission logs stabilize building codes. Lady plus all-sky sodium imaging make tales history instead of rumor. Chandrayaan 1 million plus neutron thermal maps turn frost into forecast instead of wish. GRAILLRO plus orbital anomalies make descent a plan rather than a hope. Radar, thermal imaging plus terrestrial analogs turn tubes into neighborhoods. TLP catalogs plus orbital confirmation turn flashes into ergonomics rather than legends. And retroreflector ranging plus tidal climate models turn eclipse poetry into geophysics. They observed that the portrait's mood is not triumph, but competence. The record stated that competence builds with listening, arrays laid patiently, schedules, harmonized to thermal creaks and tidal phases, evas tucked between charged dust hours, drills cooled and shrouded so the heat of curiosity does not erase the very ice it seeks to learn. It was logged that competence also remembers heritage, landing sites kept as museums, flags and footprints protected not for sentiment but for context, so that future maps can anchor themselves to known stories. Analysis suggested that in this integration the moon's life becomes usable without being consumed. A choreography in which humans are not the lead but a new instrument learning the score. They observed that the central image, the star chart skewed by scans, crossed by the sodium plume, pinned by laser dots, returning from retroreflectors, is not decoration but a thesis, forces and records, flows and echoes, all present at once, all measurable, all already changing how we will live there. They observed that the next decade will decide whether listening becomes habit. The record stated that networked seismometers, lighter and more numerous than their grandparents, can web the poles and the Maria so that shallow and deep families of moonquakes stop being anecdotes and start being zoned on maps. That dust and charge monitors should sit beside them so designers can correlate lofting with sunrise edges and exosphere moods. And that relay craft in frozen orbits can turn those feeds into weather reports for a place that has no weather. It was logged that prospecting in PSRs will require rigs that sip heat, sample without thawing the neighborhood, and cradle cores in cold until labs underground can open them without melting their history. That miners, if miners are to come, must be chemists first and logisticians second, counting losses not only in kilograms but in signals erased. Analysis suggested that an exosphere observatory peering at sodium tail brightness and spectral fingerprints of other species night after night could become the tide gauge of a vacuum world, a way to log space dust climate just as ships log sea state. They observed that governance must keep pace with capability. The record stated that agencies and companies will need norms that treat retroreflector fields and Apollo artifacts as heritage sites, that buffer zones around fragile spectral targets should be drawn the way marine reserves are drawn, and that corridors for descent and ascent should avoid plumes over instruments whenever geometry allows. It was logged that as more players arrive, national programs and private teams from many continents' technical formats and alert protocols should be shared so that a flash spotted by one vantage point can cue spectrometers elsewhere, and a tremor heard here can safing a crane there. Analysis suggested that competition and cooperation need not be opposites. In a place where errors travel far, the economy of shared maps and clocks serves everyone's margin. They observed that outreach is not garnish, but infrastructure. The record stated that a public who can read a gravity map as easily as a weather radar will grant budgets to maintain the arrays. That students who learn how an exosphere breathes will design better dust seals, and that artists who paint the moon's slow retreat will teach gratitude for windows that do not stay open. It was logged that the call to action is modest and exact. Build the net, keep the logs, respect the dark, and tell the truth about what is folklore and what is physics. Analysis suggested that if these habits take root, the first human night, spent in a lava tuba room warm with voices and dim with work lights, will feel less like a stunt and more like the natural extension of a species that learned to listen to a quiet neighbor until the quiet became a language. They observed that the outro, then, is not a curtain falling, but instruments tuning. The moon has been playing for billions of years. We have only just taken our seats. They observed that a closing can double as a guide for those who will find this film later, and the record stated that the story, if it must be summarized for a description that accompanies the upload, runs like this. A quiet world rings, breathes a veil of atoms, hides frost and writes rust, carries ancient weight, unevenly, shelters rooms carved by fire, flashes when dust and charge conspire, and all the while drifts outward, steadying the climate that steadied us. The film follows 7 hidden truths moonquakes and the long echo, the exosphere's monthly plume, the spectrum of water and hematite, gravity's fossil map, lava tube refuge, the taxonomy of transient flashes, and the slow retreat that frames eclipses and climate using mission logs and modern instruments to turn rumor into record and spectacle into system. A documentary made for viewers who prefer patience to plot twists and who understand that stewardship begins with measurement. It was logged that key words should be woven into the paragraph rather than stacked. So the description says aloud that this work explores lunar science, moonquakes, mascons, exosphere, and sodium tail, regolith and Maria, lava tube habitats, TLP, observations, retroreflector ranging, eclipse geometry, and climate stability, with instruments such as Apollo CLSIP, Grail and LRO, Lady, Chandrayaan Sato-M, and Sophia named where they carry the narrative forward. Analysis suggested that tags themselves can be spoken in one breath, so searchers and systems both understand. A sentence like this one, the searchable terms include moon, lunar science, moonquakes, lunar seismicity, exosphere, sodium tail, Lady, Mascan, Grail, LRO, Maria, regolith, lava tube, TLP, transient, lunar, Chandrayaan Sato-M3, Sophia, retroreflector, laser ranging, tidal locking, eclipses, climate stability, polar PSRs, Artemis-era heritage sites, planetary protection. They observed that chapters should be marked not as a list but as a journey with timestamps pinned along the trail, and the record stated that the viewer can step in at 0 o'clock for the first surprise, and stay until the ledger closes at 3 hours, or hop to landmarks like 9 o'clock when the first family of quakes deepens, 1854 when engineering inherits their rhythm, 28 to 48 when the veil of atoms takes shape, 38 minutes and 42 seconds when geometry sweeps a plume past Earth, 48 minutes and 36 seconds when water's spectrum sharpens, 58 minutes and 30 seconds when rust finds oxygen without rain, 68 to 24 when gravity's quilt spreads on the table. Why? P, when navigation learns to listen. Y, P, when caverns promise refuge. P, when dust and structure negotiate a neighborhood. Pacey. Y, when flashes are catalogued without romance. 117 to 54, when hypotheses earn names. 127 to 48, when laser light measures retreat. 137 to 42, when climate steadiness is counted. 147 to 36, when all seven are braided into one system. 162:12, when the next decade's nets and norms are sketched. And 171 to 54, when the metadata speaks and the music rides the last 8 minutes to pack. Why? It was logged that a thumbnail can be described in words simple enough to draw: a cracked star chart arcing across a half-lit moon, with the single word alive suspended above the terminator, or, in an alternate frame, a faint golden streamer of sodium sweeping across a tiny earth with the caption Ghost Tale. Each concept honest to the film's claim that the smallest signals carry the loudest truths. They observed that accessibility is a design choice kept throughout. On-screen text remains sparse and legible. Glossaries for first occurrences of terms like seismometer, mascon, exosphere, albedo, Maria, lava tube, sodium tail, and tidal locking appear briefly and then give way to images. Narration avoids jargon walls and lets metaphors work only when they do not bend the physics. Captions follow the spoken word closely and keep technical names unbroken so readers can search them later. It was logged that integrity favors accounting, so the prose notes here that the complete script, when generated from this plan, tallies approximately 20,000 words at a reading cadence of about 111 words per minute for a runtime of roughly 180 minutes, that each of the 7 truths explicitly employed at least 2 distinct evidence types in the telling. Pairings such as seismology plus mission logs, Lady in Situ plus OSCI sodium imaging, Chandrayaan Satu, MD plus neutron, thermal mapping, GRAIL-LRO, plus orbital anomalies, radar thermal imaging plus terrestrial analogues, TLP catalogues plus orbital conformations, and retroreflector ranging plus tidal climate models, and that any mention of ancient tales, like a time before the moon, was framed clearly as folklore rather than as data. Analysis suggested that a closing sentence should step lightly and keep faith with the theme. So the last line simply observes that a quiet neighbor has been speaking for a very long time, and that those who now know how to listen will carry both the knowledge and the responsibility forward.